And what you're looking at is the approximate difference between the general public cardiac output that's healthy versus the general public, the CFS. That's exactly what you're looking at. And it's a little bit in code, but that's what you're looking because mitochondria consumes oxygen. If you have inadequate mitochondrial function or have inadequate oxygen consumption, that happens, you affect diastolic function. If that happens, you affect cardiac output, and everything else follows. I've coined a new name. I don't know if those take on or not. I've changed the name. CFAC, or chronic fatigue-associated cardiomyopathy. Does it exist? Really? The answer to that is yes. And the first article published by Peckerman showed that in the severe cases of 38 CFS patients, and severe is defined by the level of dysfunction. So he divided them, had them fill out sheets of questionnaires, figure out how they were functioning, and then subdivided them into the more dysfunctional group versus the less dysfunctional group, which he calls severe and not severe. And 48% of his 38 people look like this in cardiac output compared to the sedentary age and sex-matched controls, supine and standing. Normal supine, 7 liters a minute. Normal standing, 5. Now, if you look up in the textbook of medicine, Guyton chapter, basically the gold standard of medical physiology, what is the Fick method determined, which is basically one of the gold standard methods, what is the Fick method determined average resting cardiac output? And the answer is 5 liters a minute. It is to be noted that the Fick method is done in the seated position, feet down. It's not done supine. Because you have to blow into have to measure, don't have you blowing on your back. You're sitting up blowing. So sitting, feet down. It's important. Because on the basis of that measurement, seated, fit down, all normal ranges have been referenced to. So when people tell you that a 5 liter per minute is normal, you have to ask, well, what position are you in? If you're on your back, 5 liters per minute is not normal. 5 liters per minute is what disabled CFS patients are. Normal people are at 7 liters a minute. But notice, as they stand up, they converge on each other. Actually, the difference gets smaller when you stand. It turns out that seated feet down is equivalent to standing. I'll say that again. Seated feet down is equivalent to standing. You might say, well, I feel worse standing than seated. That's because of the supply-demand difference. The supply-demand difference is greater standing than seated. So the issue is not so much what your output is what is your demand in relationship to the output. So a number doesn't mean much unless you know what the demand is. If you're running a marathon, you better not be putting out 7 liters a minute or you're going to die. By the way, a marathon is 25 liters a minute. 25 liters. So you have to know what you're doing. Standing takes more energy than sitting. So if sitting and standing have the same liter per minute output, I would predict on that basis that sitting is better than standing because the supply mismatch, demand mismatch is greater. That's an important idea. It's not what the number is, it's what the number is relative to what you're doing. And what you're doing can be, relative to the tissue level need, can be dramatically different between supine, standing, sitting, walking, running. Very different. So it matters a lot what the demand difference. The number doesn't mean much, per se. And we haven't even got to the other reason I'm emphasizing that the number doesn't mean as much as it sounds. This is the stroke volume. Now, impedance cardiography doesn't measure output, it measures stroke volume and then multiplies it by the heart rate. So what it measures is stroke volume, which is the filling what the heart has filled with in preparation for constriction to pump. And I'm telling you, remember I said that in CFS you don't fill well. So the stroke volume should be low, and it's significantly low here. Normal is about 115 cc's. In the supine position, and CFS patients are about 80 cc's. You'll notice how it converges on standing. Now, this is important to notice how the difference is greater supine than standing. Because the one criticism of this is that why couldn't this, if it's a stroke volume issue, why couldn't it just be dehydration? Or why couldn't it be autonomic or some other cause for a low preload issue? And the reason this argues against that is that if it's, for example, low blood volume or dehydration, it would be worse when you stand. This is worse when you lie compared to normals. Get that? You'd be worse. In comparison to normals, you'd have more trouble standing than lying. This kind of differential is seen in heart failure. It's not seen in dehydration. That's a point made in the Peckerman article in his discussion section. The one thing he noticed that argued in favor of an underlying heart problem as opposed to all the other possibilities, of which there are some, to explain this. This is my data from my clinic. Now remember, Peckerman said that the degree of output correlated with severity of the illness. They could only find 48% of his patient population that were severe enough to have low cardiac output. And mine is 82%. By virtue of that dramatic difference is nothing more than stating two things. One is that my patients are sicker than his patients. Well, that's I understand it. That'd be explainable, because his rule of thumb is I'll study you, but I will not treat you. And by the way, go off of all your medicines, and I'll study you then. So that's their philosophy, which is actually the philosophy of a lot of academic centers. That's why they don't do anything. I'll study you if you don't take anything, and by the way, I won't treat you. Who would want to go there? Except the ones that aren't very sick. I get the ones that are sick. So that's one reason. But the other reason, as I said, is that if cardiac output is a measure of dysfunction, and I have sicker patients than he does, would I not see a higher percentage? And the answer is yes. So what you're seeing displayed by the data difference is not just that my patients are sicker, but because they are sicker, they have lower cardiac output. Because this disease functionally is really in orbit around output. You are what your output is, and that is why they are as dysfunctional as the cardiomyopathics, and they are, too, more dysfunctional than any other disease. Notice that also not only are more of them abnormal, but the average value is significantly lower. And I've seen some people in my clinic, I don't know why they're alive. Their output is so low. It's down in the 2 liter per minute range, which is lower than what mine was before I got transplanted. The difference is important, though. Their output is low because they don't fill properly, but their ventricle is normal. It's just pumping nothing. It doesn't have anything to pump. My ventricle couldn't pump, so I was low for a different reason. They're low. Now, you can imagine if you're simply low because you're not pumping, what becomes critical in that situation? The answer is preload. And what is preload? It's hydration. What kind of hydration? Not just water. Water won't do it. You need to hydrate with an isotonic solution. So isotonic hydration is very critical in diastolic dysfunction. But the most critical thing in diastolic dysfunction is, and this is very important, get your feet up. The difference between output feet down, whether standing or sitting, is significantly different than feet up, whether you're lying or sitting. So get an ottoman. You all need ottomans, and you need chairs that get your feet up. It's amazing. You go up about 1 liter to 2 liters a minute by just getting your feet up in the air. You can even be sitting if you just get your feet up. And if you can't get your feet up, move them. Moving with the muscle contraction acts as a mass trouser. And if you're standing, that's really bad because your preload is really affected. See what it does to output. Even in a normal person, it knocks the output out by 30%, but you're already starting low, and although you don't go down as far as the normal person standing, but you're down in the range where you impact organ function, and most importantly, you can trigger the compensatory response of vasoconstriction ischemia reperfusion, and VEGF production. So it's just not the net. It's not solely that you go down, but it's what you do to defend yourself from going down. So if you have to stand, you start moving. Just moving. Act like you have to go to the bathroom. Just move. And this is significantly different. We did a study where we just had people do one step forward and one step backward, and what we found amazing, which mimics walking, that if they could be like this, 5 liters supine and 3.7 or so standing. But guess what they are when the same people with those numbers, guess what they are when they're doing this? They can easily jump up to 7 liters a minute just doing this.